Snowmass, Colorado, a place where the beauty of winter draws people in. A peaceful ski resort nestled in the Rocky Mountains. But in January 1975, the tranquil atmosphere of this picturesque getaway was forever shattered. A young woman named Karen Campbell disappeared without a trace from the Wildwood Lodge, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt the town for decades. Tonight, we explore her story, the story of a ski trip that ended in tragedy, the sudden and unexplained vanishing of a woman, and the long search for answers in the frozen wilderness. It was the early evening of January 11th, 1975, when 23-year-old Karen Campbell arrived at the Wildwood Lodge in Snowmass, Colorado. Karen, a nurse from Dearborn, Michigan, had made the trip with her fiancé, Dr. Raymond Gadowski, a successful physician from Farmington Hills, Michigan, and his 2 children. They were a tight-knit group, excited for a winter escape in the Colorado mountains, where they had planned 5 days of skiing. For Karen, this trip was more than just a holiday. It was a celebration of the future she was building with Dr. Gadowski, as they planned to marry later that spring. The Wildwood Lodge, their home for the trip, was one of the more popular destinations in the area. Nestled among snow-draped evergreens and towering mountains, it was the perfect spot for an unforgettable vacation. Guests would sip hot cocoa by the large stone fireplace, exchanging stories of their time on the slopes, while the lodge's large windows provided stunning views of the snow-covered terrain beyond. Karen and her fiancé checked in, thrilled at the prospect of days filled with skiing and cozy evenings together. But little did they know that this idyllic getaway would soon take a dark and unexpected turn. The first day of their trip passed like any other. The children were excited, Dr. Gadowski was relaxed, and Karen, though not an experienced skier, was eager to learn. They spent the day enjoying the resort's amenities and planned to take lessons the next morning. Dinner that evening was uneventful. A warm meal at a nearby restaurant just down the slope from the lodge itself. The couple chatted quietly, savoring their time together, as the children talked excitedly about their plans for the next day. After dinner, despite the bitter cold of the January night, they decided to walk back to the lodge rather than take the shuttle. Snow crunched beneath their feet, the wind stung their cheeks, but the warmth between them made the cold seem almost bearable. They reached the lodge around 8:30 p.m., ready to settle in for the night. Karen, always organized, excused herself in the lobby, saying she needed to go upstairs to their second-floor room to grab a magazine she'd left behind. No one thought twice about it. It was a simple task, one that would only take a few minutes. Dr. Gadowski remained in the lobby with the children, chatting idly. He expected Karen to return quickly, but the minutes ticked by, and Karen didn't come back. At first, Dr. Gadowski wasn't worried. Karen was independent and capable. Perhaps she had simply been delayed, or maybe she had found something else to do upstairs. After all, the lodge was large, with many distractions and guests moving about. But after more than 15 minutes had passed, he grew concerned. Something wasn't right. He left the children in the lobby and went upstairs to check on Karen. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and as he stepped onto the second floor, he was met with silence. The hallways were quiet, dimly lit by the warm glow of wall sconces. Dr. Gadowski reached their room, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. But there was no sign of Karen. Her belongings were untouched. Her skis, her coat. Everything was as they had left it earlier that evening. The room was empty. As the minutes continued to pass, worry set in. Dr. Gadowski checked other parts of the lodge. Perhaps she had wandered into another area or bumped into someone she knew. But Karen was nowhere to be found. He returned to the lobby, asking staff and guests if they had seen her. 2 guests reported seeing her leave the elevator on the second floor, walking in the direction of her room. But beyond that, there was nothing. It was as if she had vanished. The lodge staff quickly contacted local law enforcement. The police arrived within the hour, and the search began in earnest. Officers searched every corner of the lodge, every hallway, every closet, every room. They even checked the crawl spaces and elevator shafts, hoping that somehow she had slipped into an unseen area. But there was no sign of a struggle, no sign of a break-in or forced entry. There was nothing. Guests were questioned. Over 100 people staying at the lodge were interviewed by the police, but no one had seen anything suspicious. There were no witnesses, no strange individuals lurking about, no sign of a struggle or an argument. Dr. Gadowski, heartbroken and distraught, was questioned extensively, but nothing in his behavior suggested foul play. The couple was happy, deeply in love, and excited for their future together. Karen wasn't the type to simply run away, and there was no indication that she had left the lodge voluntarily. A full-scale search of the area was quickly organized. Ski patrols combed the surrounding hills, hoping to find some trace of Karen in the snow-covered landscape. But the weather was brutal. Temperatures had dropped to well below freezing, and the snow made travel almost impossible for anyone on foot. The idea that Karen could have wandered off in the night seemed unlikely. She was last seen inside the lodge, just moments before her disappearance. But despite the odds, the search continued. The surrounding roads were monitored, and public transport operators were notified of her description. But there was no sign of Karen. As days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Investigators were left baffled. They had searched every inch of the lodge and the surrounding area, but there was still no sign of Karen Campbell. The lodge became a place of quiet unease, its usual winter visitors replaced by the heavy presence of law enforcement and journalists. all speculating on what might have happened. Karen's family, devastated by the lack of answers, returned to Michigan, holding on to the fragile hope that somehow she might still be found alive. The investigation hit a dead end. Without evidence of a crime, the police were left with few options. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no suspects. Dr. Gadowski, though questioned extensively, was quickly ruled out as a suspect. His love for Karen was genuine, and there was no history of conflict between them. Friends and family confirmed that they'd been looking forward to their upcoming wedding, and there were no signs that Karen had left voluntarily. But if she hadn't run away, then where was she? Days passed. The search was scaled back, and eventually, it was called off. For a time, the mystery of Karen Campbell's disappearance seemed like it might never be solved. Investigators were left with no answers, and the town of Snowmass returned to its quiet routine, the memory of the missing woman slowly fading into the background. But then, on February 17th, 1975, a shocking discovery was made. Just over a month after Karen disappeared, the snow began to melt, revealing what had been hidden beneath its icy grip. A motorist driving along Owl Creek Road, just a few miles from Snowmass, spotted something unusual on the side of the road. At first, it looked like a piece of discarded clothing, something left behind in the snow. But as the driver approached, they realized it was something far more horrifying. The naked body of a woman lay partially buried in the snow, her frozen remains exposed by the melting ice. The authorities were called immediately. The body, decomposed and partially consumed by wildlife, was in terrible condition. Identifying her would not be easy, but investigators feared the worst. The remains were transported to Denver General Hospital, where dental records confirmed what everyone had dreaded. The body was that of Karen Campbell. The autopsy revealed the grim details of Karen's final moments. She had been brutally beaten, suffering several blows to the head with a blunt object. The trauma was so severe that it had fractured her skull. It was clear that she had been murdered shortly after her disappearance. In addition to the head injuries, there were signs that Karen had been bound at the wrists, and the evidence pointed to a sexual assault. The level of violence inflicted upon her was shocking. Her body had been left exposed to the elements, discarded like refuse along the side of a remote road. For the investigators, the discovery brought both relief and renewed horror. They now knew what had happened to Karen, but they still had no answers about who had taken her life. The Pitkin County Sheriff's Office, under the direction of District Attorney Frank Tucker, vowed to find her killer. But the case was already growing cold. much like the snow-covered landscape that had hidden her remains for so long. Speculation began to swirl. The brutality of the crime led some investigators to believe that Karen's death was not an isolated incident. Across the western United States, reports of missing women had been growing at an alarming rate. Young women, many of them college-aged, had been disappearing from public places, never to be seen again. Some of their bodies were eventually found, others remained missing, but all shared a common thread. They had vanished without a trace, often in broad daylight or from areas where they should have been safe. In Karen's case, however, there was little physical evidence to work with. Her body had been exposed to the elements for over a month, and much of the forensic material that might have been recovered was lost. Investigators combed through the limited evidence they had, but there were no clear leads, and so the mystery deepened. As the months dragged on, the investigation into Karen Campbell's murder seemed to stall. But behind the scenes, a far larger picture was beginning to emerge. In states like Utah, Washington, and Idaho, detectives were working on cases that bore striking similarities to Karen's. Young women, often with similar physical appearances, had vanished from public spaces, universities, parks, and like Karen, ski resorts. In particular, one case from Utah stood out. In November of 1974, just a few months before Karen's disappearance, an 18-year-old woman named Carol DeRanch had been abducted by a man who claimed to be a police officer. She was lured into his car, a tan Volkswagen Beetle, under the pretense of being taken to a station for questioning. But once inside the vehicle, she realized something was terribly wrong. The man attempted to handcuff her, but she fought back, managing to escape. Her brave actions saved her life, but her abductor had slipped away into the night. It wasn't until later that investigators began to see the connections. A man had been seen driving a tan Volkswagen Beetle near the scenes of multiple disappearances, including the one involving Carol DeRanch. As the investigation unfolded, detectives started to piece together a chilling profile of the man who had been terrorizing young women across multiple states. The same man who, as it turned out, had been in Colorado at the time of Karen Campbell's disappearance. His name was Ted Bundy. The name Ted Bundy would soon become synonymous with terror as the truth of his crimes came to light. Bundy, a charming and seemingly normal law student, had been traveling across the country, abducting and murdering young women. His methods were disturbingly effective. He used his good looks, intelligence, and charm to lure his victims into a false sense of security. In some cases, He pretended to be injured, wearing a sling or a cast, while in others, he posed as a figure of authority, such as a police officer. Once he had his victims alone, the true horror began. Bundy's credit card records placed him in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, on January 12, 1975, the night Karen Campbell disappeared. His Volkswagen Beetle, the same car he had used to abduct other women, was linked to the scene. In the trunk of that car, investigators would later find hair samples from multiple victims, including Karen Campbell. But Bundy didn't stop with Karen. His spree of terror continued, claiming the lives of dozens of young women across the United States. For years, he evaded capture, using his charm and intelligence to outwit law enforcement. It wasn't until his final arrest that the full extent of his crimes would be revealed. Though Bundy never fully confessed to Karen Campbell's murder, the evidence against him was overwhelming. He had been in the area, his methods matched, and forensic evidence linked him to the crime. In the end, Bundy would be convicted of multiple murders, but the full scope of his atrocities remains unknown. He hinted at more victims, telling investigators that there were other bodies buried across the country, but he refused to provide details. For Karen Campbell's family, the truth was both devastating and incomplete. They would never get the full closure they so desperately needed. In the end, Karen Campbell was just one of many victims whose lives were cut short by the darkness lurking in the mind of a predator. Snowmass, once a place of beauty and peace, became the site of an unspeakable horror. And though her story ended in tragedy, her memory lives on as a reminder of the evil that can hide behind even the most innocent of faces. Tonight, as the cold wind howls outside, let the weight of this story settle in. Some mysteries may be solved, but the scars they leave behind, those last forever. Rest now, and may the quiet of the night bring you peace.